Sorry about that, babe.
I contemplated even doing a review for Simon's Quest. I mean, let's be real, it's been covered since the dawn of YouTube, most notably by the Angry Video Game Nerd and beyond. And I think most people in the know realize that the game isn't actually that bad as it was portrayed in said AVGN video. But the Castlevania series, specifically the older games, have been so near and dear to me that I felt compelled to continue on with my coverage. Released in North America on the Nintendo Entertainment System in December of 1988, Castlevania II Simon's Quest is an action, sort of role-playing game hybrid developed and published by Konami, serving as the sequel to the great Castlevania. The story. 7 years after the events of the first Castlevania, you are back in action as Simon Belmont. A curse has been placed upon you by Dracula himself after your previous showdown. Reminiscent of another NES classic, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Dracula has been broken up into bits and it's your job to track all of his parts down, return them to Dracula's castle, or Castlevania, bring the Count back to life, and then finally put him back to rest? Anyway, it is a pretty straightforward and digestible story. Some of it anyway. Graphics. Simon's Quest very much has that NES Castlevania feel to it. The graphics are sharp, the colors pop and add to the atmosphere, and each area has its own feel. Even if they are a bit asset reusey, so to speak, at least the color palettes swap for differentiation. One of my favorite things in gaming are changes of weather, or in the case of Simon's Quest, day to night, giving a different feel graphically during the differing times of the day. Some small touches that I enjoy are the use of the sub-weapons, the glowing of the orb containing a piece of Dracula, the glowing and transition of the laurel usage, and upgrading Simon's whip, eventually getting to the sick-looking flame whip. In ways, I feel like they are a slight step up from the first Castlevania, and in general, I think you can tell right away that it's Simon's Quest when looking at it, which is a good thing, makes it unique. Music and sound. I've been playing a lot of games with great soundtracks lately, and Simon's Quest falls right in line. Composed mainly by Kenichi Matsubara, but also receiving help from Satoe Terashima and Yoshiaki Itano, Simon's Quest boasts not only one of the best Castlevania soundtracks, 8-bit soundtracks, but one of the best overall soundtracks of all time. The title track, Message of Darkness, brings that ominous feel of the journey ahead for Simon. The track, Silence of Daylight, has that slight note of an upbeat nature during the daytime in the towns. Then of course, getting into the meat of the matter, Bloody Tears is easily one of the greatest video game tracks of all time, not even up for debate. I actually had a metal rendition of that as my quote title theme for my old videos pre-Bits and Glory era, true story. Then you also have the Monster Dance track for the nighttime exploring, Dwelling of Doom for the mansions, within these castle walls for Castle Dracula or Castlevania. Geez, don't get me wrong, it's not like these are super long Final Fantasy style epic tracks or anything, but goddamn do they get the job done and do it well. I actually recently picked this up on vinyl after a long holdout and I don't regret it for a second. It is also worth mentioning that the sound is pretty NES run-of-the-mill. I feel like it's adequate for its delivery and presentation, though at times it can be annoying. For example, the sounds of the holy water could be a little bit grating. Controls. If you are at all familiar with the first Castlevania, the controls will be very second nature to you in Simon's Quest. Realistically, Simon controls almost exactly the same. Moving forward, backward, jumping, whipping, going up and down stairs, using sub-weapons, it's all very familiar. Yes, you even have the patented Castlevania knockback that everyone loves. Really, the biggest differences in Simon's Quest are talking to the townsfolk, merchants, and priests, accessing the menu system to select various sub-weapons, items, and pieces of Dracula, which I will admit can be slightly clunky navigating and equipping properly. The menuing isn't overtly terrible, but I did have a few gaffes over the years, and most importantly, really getting to the edge of some of the platforming jumps and utilizing the up and down physics factor for the boosts. Pitfalls are still probably the biggest obstacle in terms of difficulty in Simon's Quest, and this can take a bit to get used to, but all in all I didn't have too many troubles, but can admit some of the platforming segments could be a bit especially to someone without lots of experience. Gameplay and fun factor. Probably the coolest part and biggest differentiator of Simon's Quest from the rest, wow what a rhyme, is the fact that essentially it's an adventure or RPG hybrid. This basically is the birth of the Vania part of Metroidvania. No longer is Castlevania a simple point A to point B journey, you can go wherever you want with some limits based on progression, but the world feels vast and perilous with plenty to explore, including some optional areas, paths, and items not needed in order to complete the game. And I do want to point out that yes, Metroid came out first in terms of this Metroidvania style, but this is the first Castlevania that falls under the Metroidvania style, so to speak. Anyways, the gist of your journey as mentioned is collecting pieces of Dracula from the 5 mansions. Some of these Dracula pieces are very important, such as the rib, which serves as a shield to help Simon deflect projectiles, or the heart, which allows you to take a different path with the ferryman in order to continue on with the game. Before I get carried away with the sub-weapons, special items, and upgrades, it's worth noting that the hearts in Simon's Quest primarily serve as currency to buy things such as whip upgrades, laurels, garlic, oak stakes for the mansions, and most importantly in the opening town of Jova, holy water and the white crystal. Some of the more advanced sub-weapons like the secret sacred flame, diamond, the silver and gold knives, they do consume a small number of hearts upon use, which is similar to the first Castlevania, but hearts come plenty and the main use is indeed as currency. A couple of key factors in Simon's Quest revolve around the day to night cycles, which could play in both the ending that you receive upon game completion, as well as the amount of hearts dropped by the enemies. Essentially, nighttime equals more hearts and harder enemies. And for the endings, beating the game in 7 days or less, you get the best ending, 8 to 14 days, the normal ending, and 15 plus is the bad, but with a catch, and we'll touch on that later. Speaking of enemies, Simon's Quest has a pretty standard fare for those. Skellies, bats, eyeballs, spiders, and slimes, they litter the world. But there were a few enemies that did catch my eye, such as the Kage Doom, Flame Man, which reminds me of the one in TMNT on the NES a bit, and the wolves. But overall a pretty standard affair. Another aspect that lends itself to the RPG hybrid is leveling. You start at level 0 and can ascend all the way to level 6. The more levels you go up, the more experience is needed, but with a catch. You have to keep progressing through the game and can't stay in the same old easy areas grinding, which may or may not bug the RPG enthusiast. Kind of an easy way to mentally note it is, you can more or less gain a level in each of the mansions and apparently up to 2 in the final one. And as you level up, your life meter refills, increases at times, and the amount of damage taken goes down. But be warned, if you do run out of lives and have to use to continue, you will lose all of your hearts. Simon's Quest isn't the toughest game in the series by a long shot. There can be bouts of difficulty, especially if you don't know where you're going, and some platforming segments. But if you do have trouble with the game, there is a password system to pick up where you left off, or you could experiment with some other passwords for some interesting combinations. Critiques. I gotta hand it to the NES. This era was chock full of interesting sequels. Whether it be Zelda to Zelda 2, Super Mario to Super Mario 2, Doki Doki Panic stuff aside, TMNT to TMNT 2, there's many instances of dramatic gameplay changes and Simon's Quest is no exception. To some, this change is way too drastic and not as fun. But for me, I actually like it. I applaud people thinking outside of the box and trying something new. That being said, there are some elements of Simon's Quest that grind my gears and the Castlevania clock tower of my mind. 3 main things jump out at me. The first is the mistranslation and subsequent cryptic spots. You have your few bouts of English here and there, such as possessing pieces of Dracula, but honestly that doesn't bother me too much. However, there are hints throughout the game that are translated poorly and at times outright wrong. Without a guide of some sort, this would prove fairly difficult for you to figure out on your own. Things such as the red crystal kneel to get the whirlwind or tornado taxi. Your main in-game hint is wait for a soul with a red crystal on Deborah Cliff, almost insinuating that someone should be there or show up. Another is a crooked trader is offering bum deals in this town, when in reality they're just trying to tell you that there are merchants hiding in the towns, not scamming you, which you will obviously find as you progress through your journey. Now this is a bit overinflated. There's not that many instances of outright wrong information. But in general the translation is poor, there's a fair amount of useless information, and I do recommend playing something such as Simon's Quest Redacted, which I did do a few years back, with fixed dialogue and translations. You also of course have a few instances of orb squatting, that for the uninformed could present a roadblock in your progression. It's also worth noting that the ending screen text is also flubbed. For example, the bad ending gives you really uplifting text. You really can't make that stuff up. The translation isn't that good. The second thing is the day to night transition and time passage in general. Yes, what a horrible night to have a curse indeed. I will admit that this transition should be way quicker than it is in the game, though it doesn't seem to bother me as much as some other people. It's also a bit funky. Basically the time progresses as you play, but it halts where you're on the menu screen, in dialogue, in a town dwelling, or in one of the mansions / Castlevania at the end. Apparently, if not interrupted at all, it takes 3 minutes real time to transition from day to night. At times this can be really annoying because the towns close up shop at night and get overrun by monsters, and there will be many instances where you don't need hearts, don't care about leveling, and then you just have to sit there for 3 minutes to wait to buy your goods or stop at a church. Don't get me wrong, a minor annoyance, but an annoyance nonetheless. Now, my biggest critique of Simon's Quest, the difficulty. It's just not that difficult. Again, there are instances of difficulty. Getting lost can easily spell your doom. Being under-equipped can easily thwart your journey's progress. There's some tough pitfalls and enemies. But the biggest change between Castlevania and Castlevania II Simon's Quest are the bosses, or lack thereof. There are only 3 bosses in Simon's Quest, and one of them, probably the hardest of the bunch, isn't even that hard if dealt with appropriately. Of course, I'm speaking about Death or the Grim Reaper, and this boss isn't even required. He's optional, but he is worth defeating for the gold knife. The next boss, Carmilla, while iconic in design, is also incredibly easy when dealt with appropriately. And the same goes for Dracula himself. As long as you have the Sacred Flame, the Gold Knife, none of these bosses should pose any amount of trouble to you even on super low health. A little bit disappointing all things considered. In summation, Simon's Quest has all the makings of a legendary Castlevania entry, paving the path forward for future Castlevania games. The freedom to explore and RPG elements were much welcomed on my end. Unfortunately, with the translation, cryptic nature of some spots, and most importantly the lacking difficulty in bosses, Simon's Quest does leave a bit to be desired. Now I want to put this out there, I am a Simon's Quest fan. But looking at it from an objective point of view, it's nowhere near the best entry in the series. As such, I give Simon's Quest on the NES a 7 out of 10. Again, I recommend playing the Simon's Quest Redacted ROM hack. It improves on many of the issues that are present in the game, but even that doesn't really address the difficulty issue too much, which does prevent this from being a top dog in the franchise. All that being said, Castlevania II Simon's Quest is a good game, and I do recommend that you play it. Don't buy into all the negative hype that you may have seen on the internet over the years. If you've enjoyed this review, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing if you haven't already. If you want to check out my various Castlevania coverages up until this point, I'll make sure to list them in the pinned comment, description, and end screen. Take care.